They were having bad thoughts about Allah. Yet this is exactly what happened. And the Sahaba couldn't break the rock, so they called the Prophet ﷺ, who was physically very strong. They discovered the black oil. This is actually a photo from the early 20th century of these Bedouin Arabs. These two were superpowers. He didn't tell them you're going to win against these 10,000. He said you're going to win against Rome and Persia. It's not good to have extravagant tall buildings. A time will come in the world when the world will be laid open for them. They were the ones who were actually saying, this man talks about victory when we cannot go to the toilet without arrows being shot at us. And they take on Russia and they take on USA. The Prophet ﷺ could have said, they are going to compete with each other with tall buildings. Remember, the Bedouin did not even have houses, right? Russia and the United States, they were superpowers. They will become extremely rich until they compete with each other in the construction of tall buildings. So if it was a prophecy which the Prophet ﷺ wanted to come true, he would have said it about the city Arabs. However, today the tallest buildings in the world. Now we start off on a quick sort of journey about the Prophet ﷺ, right? He claimed he was a true messenger of God. And what we find is, according to the criteria which I mentioned previously, if you go back one slide, he makes predictions which we can actually test in this way. In fact, what you will not really find is that not only are his predictions within this matrix, they actually surpass this matrix as well. Why? Because there's one aspect which I didn't put in this criteria, which you can actually apply to the other, which I didn't actually apply to the other people, which is counterfactuals. Sometimes the Prophet ﷺ will say something and then say something else, and these two things seem to contradict, yet they both actually happened. Because it seems one will contradict the other, but that doesn't actually happen. And I didn't even put that as a criteria for the other people, but for the Prophet ﷺ, that even goes through. Next slide, please. He spoke about the defeat of Rome and Persia. What we have is, we have a narration from him. During the Battle of Khandaq, there was a massive rock, and the Sahaba couldn't break the rock. So they called the Prophet ﷺ, who was physically very strong, and he came and he struck the rock. And what did he tell the Sahaba? He said, you're going to conquer Syria, you're going to conquer Persia, you are going to conquer Yemen. He made it very explicitly clear. And this is at the time when the Muslims were just in Medina and they're surrounded by 10,000 of their army. And there's no other Muslims in Arabia. He didn't tell them you're going to win against these 10,000. He said you're going to win against Rome and Persia, which is incredible when you think about it. Because the Munafiqs, they were saying what? They weren't even calling Medina, Medina. They were calling Yathrib. They were having bad thoughts about Allah. They were the ones who were actually saying, this man talks about victory when we cannot go to the toilet without arrows being shot at us. So clearly, if you look at it from a historical point of view, we're not even at this stage where you have Rome and you have Persia and you have the time of the Caliphate where you have a strong central state. No, all of Islam was in one city, and the Prophet ﷺ said this. Yet this is exactly what happened. The Muslims, after he died, they conquered Rome, they conquered Persia, they conquered the areas of Syria and Yemen, which were under Roman control, and they conquered Persia. So they beat them all. Now, what's interesting is what a historian, Barnbury Rogerson, says about this astonishing event. And there's other people who've spoken about this event as well. But he just says these words which I just love, right? He says, these two were superpowers. Russia and the United States, they were superpowers. And he said the equivalent today and the equivalent at that time, if you want to think about it, is imagine today Eskimos rise up and they take on Russia and they take on USA. That's how significant the Sahaba and their victories against Rome and Persia was. It was completely unpredictable. And there's actually a lot of historical evidence for of historians speaking about this very difficult event to explain in terms of material resources, right? Another time a man came up to the Prophet ﷺ and said, tell me about the hour. The Prophet said, the one asked knows no more of it than the one asking. Then the man said, tell me about his signs. And the Prophet said, that you see the barefooted, unclothed herdsmen competing in the construction of tall buildings. Right? Very explicitly clear, falsifiable, concrete, accurate, risky. Risky. Why is it risky? Because who had a tradition of building tall buildings? The Hagia Sophia, which is in Istanbul, this was built before this prophecy. And this is an extravagant tall building. The Romans had tall buildings, the Persians had tall buildings, the Indians had tall buildings, the Chinese had tall buildings. The Mayans had tall buildings. The Prophet ﷺ could have said, they're going to compete with each other with tall buildings. However, he didn't say them. He actually pointed towards a certain type of Arab, the Bedouin Arabs. Now, from the history of the Arabs, there have been two types of Arabs. They are city Arabs and they are Bedouin Arabs. What type of Arab was the Prophet ﷺ? Nope, he was a city Arab. The Bedouin Arabs were the people of the desert. They were the people of the desert. They had goats and milk and they had these things. They didn't have the sophisticated language and not language, but the sophistication of the city life. However, I just want you to understand something. The Muslims came and they set up the first state, right? As we call them, the rightly guided Khalifas. And then you had the Umayyads, then you had the Abbasids, then you had the Ottomans, and obviously in this part of the world you had the Mughals. You had massive Islamic civilizations. Massive Islamic civilizations. The Bedouin Arabs were doing the exact same thing during these great times of scientific achievement and economic and political achievement that they were doing before the Prophet ﷺ. They were milking camels, drinking camel's milk, and just herding sheep and camels. The Arabs at the golden age, when they were looking into the deep mysteries of the universe, these people were still using the feces of camel as fuel. Right? That's what these people were doing. Next slide, please. This is actually a photo from the early 20th century of these Bedouin Arabs. Early 20th century, right? Now, the prophecy is so clear that hundreds of years ago, Imam Nawawi says this, and remember, he's from the 13th century, right? He said, the people of the desert and their like are the people of need and poverty. Everybody knows that. A time will come in the world when the world will be laid open for them until they compete with each other in the construction of tall buildings, and Allah knows best. Imam Qurtubi, again in the 13th century, 700 years ago, 800 years ago, he says this: what is meant here is the prediction of a reversal in society whereby the people of the desert will take over the construction of affairs and rule every region by force. They will become extremely rich. They will become extremely rich, and their primary concern will be to erect tall buildings and take pride in them. So the Prophet ﷺ is talking about a group of people who didn't even have houses. Remember, the Bedouin did not even have houses, right? And he's saying they are going to compete with each other with tall buildings. Now, what's interesting about this prophecy as well is the Prophet ﷺ, actually go back 2 slides, please. The Prophet ﷺ, and in the Quran, it's not good to have extravagant tall buildings. In fact, the Prophet's own mosque, when it became too big for the people worshipping there, the Sahaba wanted to build it, extend it, and the Prophet didn't want that. In the Quran, Allah says, do you build on every high a monument? Vain is what you do, and you make strong fortresses as if you will live you'd live forever. So if it was a prophecy which the Prophet ﷺ wanted to come true, he would have said it about the city Arabs, which were the Sahaba, and told them, and it would have been his sunnah to build tall buildings. But he never did that. He didn't tell people to do that. In fact, it was the opposite. Go back 2 slides. Okay, this is Sir Wilfrid Thijsberger. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Sounds German. As recently as the 1940s, and he just passed away just 2003. That's why you see this picture, which is colored. He's writing about these people in the early 20th century. And he basically says this: as I listened through once again how precarious was the existence of the Bedou, their way of life naturally made them fatalists. So much was beyond their control. It was impossible for them to provide for a morrow when everything depended on a chance fall of rain, or when raiders, sickness, or any one of 100 chance events happened to make them destitute or end their lives. They did what they did, and no people were more self-reliant. But if things went wrong, they accepted it as their fate without bitterness and with dignity as the will of God. Now if you look up his works, he describes them, and they are exactly like the Prophet ﷺ described them during his lifetime, right? However, today the tallest buildings in the world, in terms of percentage-wise where they're built, is in the Middle East, is in the areas of the Bedouin Arabs. The tallest building in the world is where? Dubai. And what's it called? Burj Khalifa. Burj Khalifa. When Burj Khalifa was being built or completed or whatever, I think even before it was actually completed, the Kingdom Tower, a random family, a rival family in Saudi Arabia, they said, we want to build a taller building, which is going to be 1,000 meters. And this vain competing with each other, is something that you find amongst them. What's interesting is that they discovered the black oil, the gold, which was something that made them go from overnight from camels to Cadillacs. Instantly. Now, who was ruling this area before the Bedouins that we have today? Who's ruling this area?
Which one? Which area?
The Middle East. Turks. When did the Turkish Empire, the Ottomans, collapse? And how long were they running for? The Ottomans? 600 years. Oil was discovered, which made them super rich, after the collapse of the Ottomans. If that oil was discovered when the Ottoman Empire was still there, do you think the Bedouin Arabs would have been building these tall buildings? Because they wouldn't have had the money. In fact, what we know from the Ottoman history is that they were great administrators, and they wouldn't have built vain buildings like this. They actually, they had a complete different paradigm. Yeah, these people overnight, they went from being extremely poor to extremely rich, which is why you find them spending a huge amount of money, and for them, money doesn't mean anything. You literally have people alive today who are billionaires, whose ancestors, just going back 2 or 3 generations, had nothing but camels and milk and goat and dates.
If you like our content, then please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for latest updates. Thank you.